"I have nowhere to go tonight," the little girl said, and the words didn't echo, didn't rise, didn't beg. They simply landed in the cold air between them and stayed there like something too heavy to move. The rain had just started, a thin, steady drizzle that turned the parking lot into a mirror of blurred neon and trembling reflections, and William Carter stood under the overhang of the glass building he owned, one hand still holding his phone, the last words of a nine-figure deal fading from his ear as if they belonged to someone else entirely. He wasn't supposed to stop. Not here. Not for this. Not for a child in an oversized hoodie, standing 5 feet away with shoes too thin for the weather, and a small worn backpack clutched against her chest like it mattered more than anything else she had. "Sir, she can't stay here," the security guard muttered, stepping forward with practiced politeness, already reaching for the kind of tone that moved problems away, but William didn't answer. Right away, because the girl hadn't moved, hadn't lowered her eyes, hadn't done what people usually did when they wanted something. She just stood there, steady, rain collecting on the edges of her braids, her gaze clear in a way that made everything else feel louder than it was. "I'm not asking for money," she added softly, as if correcting something he hadn't said yet, and that was the moment something in him paused, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to interrupt the rhythm he had built his entire life around. Most people asked for money, or favors, or something they could measure, but this was different. This was a sentence that didn't come with a price tag. William finally lowered his phone, sliding it into his coat pocket as the city noise pressed in around them. Distant traffic, the hum of engines, the quiet hiss of rain against concrete. And he stepped a little closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to hear her without the world in between. "Then what are you asking for?" he said, his voice calmer than he expected, and the girl shifted her weight slightly, hugging the backpack tighter as if it held the answer. "Just somewhere to sit for a while," she said, her voice still small but steady. "Just until it stops feeling like this," and he didn't understand the last part at first, not fully, but he felt it. The way the words carried something heavier than the night itself. The guard exhaled quietly, glancing at William for a decision, a signal, anything that would restore order to the moment. But William's eyes stayed on the girl because she wasn't shivering the way he expected. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trying to convince him of anything. She was simply stating a fact, and somehow that made it harder to turn away. A gust of wind pushed rain further under the overhang, and the girl took a small step back, careful not to step too close to the door, as if she already knew where the invisible line was. William noticed the detail, the way she respected a boundary no one had explained, and something tightened in his chest, something unfamiliar, something that didn't belong in boardrooms or contracts. "What's your name?" he asked, and she hesitated just a second before answering. "Amara," and the name settled into the space between them like it had been there longer than the moment itself. He nodded slowly, glancing once at the dark street beyond the parking lot, then back at her, and for the first time that night, the world he controlled so precisely felt slightly out of reach, like a script he didn't recognize anymore. "Amara," he repeated, quieter now, as if testing the weight of it. And then he did something that didn't fit the version of himself everyone else knew. Something small, almost invisible, but enough to change the direction of the night. He stepped aside from the doorway, just a few inches, creating space where there hadn't been any before, and said, "You can sit here for now." As the rain continued to fall, and the city carried on, unaware that something quiet and irreversible had just begun. Amara did not move right away, as if the space he had created might disappear if she trusted it too quickly, and William noticed that hesitation more than anything else because it was not fear exactly. It was caution shaped by experience, the kind that made a child measure every step before taking it. The security guard shifted beside them, clearing his throat softly, uncertain whether to step in again or step back. But William gave a small shake of his head without looking away, and that was enough for the man to retreat a pace, hands folding in front of him as the rain continued to whisper against the pavement. Amara finally lowered herself onto the edge of the concrete ledge near the entrance, careful, controlled, placing her backpack on her lap, as if it were something fragile, something that could not be set down without consequence. And she kept her feet tucked close together, as though trying to take up as little space as possible. William remained standing for a moment longer, Watching the way she adjusted her sleeves, pulling them down over her hands, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs, and he realized with a quiet jolt that she was not trying to get comfortable. She was trying to stay contained, to not ask for more than what had been given. He exhaled slowly and leaned back against the glass wall, the cool surface pressing through his coat, grounding him in a way he had not expected. And for the first time that evening, the building behind him felt less like a fortress and more like a barrier he had chosen. "It is going to get colder," he said after a moment, not as a warning, but as an observation, and Amara nodded once, her eyes still forward, watching the rain as it traced thin lines down the sloped asphalt. "I will be okay," she replied, her voice steady but quiet, and there was no defiance in it, just a statement. The kind people make when they have already decided what they can endure. William studied her for a second, then reached up and loosened his scarf, a dark wool piece that had cost more than most people would think to spend on something so simple. And he hesitated only briefly before holding it out, not stepping closer, just offering it within reach. Amara glanced at it, then at him, her expression unreadable for a beat too long, and he almost pulled it back, almost retreated into the version of himself that avoided moments like this. But then she spoke again, softer this time. "You do not have to do that," and he found himself answering without thinking, "I know," which seemed to change something because after a second, she reached out and took it, her small fingers careful not to brush his hand, and wrapped it loosely around her neck, not like someone claiming warmth, but like someone accepting it with respect. The guard looked away, giving them privacy without being told, and the world outside continued its rhythm, headlights sliding across wet pavement, engines passing, distant voices carried by the wind, but within that small space near the door, everything felt quieter, more contained. William let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding and slid his hands into his coat pockets, unsure what to do with them otherwise, and he realized that for all his experience, all his control, he did not have a script for this, no clear next step that fit into the structure of his life. "Is there someone you can call?" he asked, the question careful, measured, and Amara shook her head slightly, her eyes lowering for the first time, not in shame, but in thought. "Not tonight," she said, and those two words carried something heavier than the sentence itself, something that suggested there had been other nights, other attempts, other answers that did not hold. William felt that unfamiliar tightening again, the one that did not belong to numbers or negotiations, and he looked out at the rain, then back at her, and something in his mind shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to make the next thought impossible to ignore, because for the first time in a long time, walking away did not feel like the easier choice, it felt like the wrong one. The rain did not let up, it thickened slightly, tapping against the glass behind William in a steady rhythm that made the silence between them feel more deliberate, more chosen, and Amara adjusted the scarf again, pulling it closer around her neck, not out of habit but out of awareness, as if she was still deciding whether she was allowed to be warm. William watched that small movement and felt something shift deeper this time, something that did not fade when he looked away, and he straightened from the wall, taking a slow step forward before stopping himself, careful not to close the distance too quickly, because everything about her suggested that space mattered. "Amara," he said, more gently now, testing the way her name felt when it was not just a question but an invitation to stay in the moment, and she looked up at him again, her eyes steady despite the long night pressing around them. "Yes, sir," she answered, polite without being submissive, and he noticed that too, the way she carried herself, like someone who understood respect but did not trade it for approval. He hesitated for half a second, not because he did not know what to say, but because what he was about to say did not belong to the version of himself he had built over years of careful control, and then he let it out anyway. "You said tonight is the worst night," and the words hung there, not accusatory, not probing, just open. Amara's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her backpack, and for the first time, her gaze shifted away from him, not out of fear, but out of memory, as if she was looking at something he could not see. "It is the night the lights go out," she said quietly, and he frowned just a little, not understanding yet, and she added after a breath, "At home." And the way she said home made it sound less like a place and more like something fragile, something that could disappear if named too loudly. William felt that same unfamiliar pressure in his chest again, and this time it did not feel like something to ignore. It felt like something asking to be answered. "Where is home?" he asked, softer now, and she shook her head once, almost apologetically. "Not far," she said, "just far enough." And the answer was not precise, but it was honest in a way that made precision unnecessary. A car passed by, its headlights sweeping across them for a brief second, illuminating the contrast in a single frame: the polished glass, the tailored coat, the small figure on the ledge holding everything she owned in one bag. And when the light moved on, the moment stayed. William reached into his pocket again, not for his phone this time, but for something to do with his hands, and found nothing that made sense in this situation. No card, no instruction, no solution that could be signed or approved. And that realization settled heavier than he expected. "Do you have anyone with you?" he asked, and Amara shook her head again, but then added after a pause, "I have to go back soon." And that caught him off guard, because nothing about her suggested she had anywhere to go that was better than this. "Why?" he asked before he could stop himself, and she looked at him again, directly this time, and there was something in her eyes that made the question feel smaller than her answer. "Because someone is waiting," she said, and the way she said it changed everything, because it was not about her anymore. It was about someone else, someone unseen, someone who depended on her return. William felt the shift immediately. The problem he had been quietly defining in his mind no longer fit the frame he had given it. This was not a child looking for shelter. This was a child carrying responsibility that should not have been hers to carry, and the weight of that realization pressed into the silence between them. The guard glanced over again, sensing the change without understanding it, but said nothing, and William stood there for a moment longer, the rain, the city, the glass behind him, all of it fading just enough for a single decision to rise above the rest. And when he spoke again, his voice was no longer uncertain. It was quieter, but clearer. "Then I am not letting you walk back alone tonight." And he did not frame it as a question, not as a command, but as something in between, something that left space for her dignity while still refusing to step away. Amara did not answer right away, and the silence that followed his words felt different from the ones before, heavier, more deliberate, as if she was measuring not just what he had said, but what it might cost her to believe it. And she shifted slightly on the ledge, her fingers tightening around the edge of her backpack while the rain continued to fall in soft, steady lines beyond the overhang. "I am used to walking," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, and there was no defiance in it. Only truth, the kind that came from repetition rather than choice. And William nodded slowly, acknowledging it without agreeing, because he understood something now that he had not understood a few minutes ago. This was not about whether she could walk alone. It was about why she had to. "I do not doubt that," he replied, his tone even, careful not to push too hard. "But tonight you do not have to." And the words settled between them, not as an order, not as pity, but as an option that had not existed before. Amara looked at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something consistent, something she could recognize. And for a moment the world outside seemed to dim again. The passing cars, the hum of the city, all of it fading just enough for that quiet exchange to take center stage. "It is not just me," she said after a second, and the way she said it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. And he gave a small nod, encouraging her without interrupting, and she continued, "My little brother is there," her voice softer now, not weaker, just more careful. "He does not like the dark when the lights go out." And William felt something shift more sharply this time, something that did not stay contained, because the picture in his mind expanded in an instant, no longer a single child in the rain, but two, one waiting somewhere unseen, trusting that she would come back. "How old is he?" William asked quietly, and Amara answered without hesitation. 4. And the number landed with a weight that made the night feel colder than it was. William exhaled slowly, glancing once toward the street, as if expecting the answer to be written somewhere in the passing headlights. But there was nothing there except movement and noise, and when he looked back at her, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough to carry a decision forming beneath it. "Then we go together," he said. And this time there was a subtle shift in his voice, not authority, but certainty, the kind that did not leave room for dismissal. Amara blinked once, caught off guard not by the offer itself, but by the way it was given, steady, without conditions, and she hesitated, her instincts pulling her in two directions, one toward independence, the other toward something she did not fully trust yet. "You do not have to do that," she said again, repeating the phrase she had used earlier, but this time. It sounded less like refusal and more like a boundary she was trying to maintain, and William gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not because the situation was light, but because he recognized the pattern now. "I know," he said again, echoing his earlier response, and something about that repetition, that consistency, seemed to soften the space between them just a fraction. The security guard shifted once more, glancing at William as if waiting for clarification, for instruction, but William did not look back, his attention still on Amara, because this moment required something different, something quieter than direction. The rain began to slow slightly, turning from a steady fall into a light mist, and the air carried that faint, damp chill that settled into everything. And Amara adjusted the scarf again, this time without hesitation, pulling it closer around her neck as if she had accepted, at least for now, that she was allowed to keep it. "It is just a few blocks," she said finally, her voice more certain now, and William nodded once, stepping away from the glass wall, the shift in his posture subtle but significant, as if he had moved from observer to participant without announcing it. "Then we will walk," he replied, and for the first time since the moment began, Amara did not argue. She simply stood, lifting her backpack onto her shoulders with practiced ease, and as she stepped toward the edge of the overhang, pausing only briefly to look back at him, there was something new in her expression, not trust yet, not fully, but something close to it, something that made the next step possible, and William followed, leaving the warmth of the building behind as they stepped into the damp, quiet street together, the distance between their two worlds narrowing with each step forward. The rain softened into a fine mist that clung to the air like a quiet breath, and the street stretched ahead of them in long reflective lines, streetlights casting warm halos onto wet pavement as Amara walked a step ahead, her small figure steady, her pace measured like someone who had walked this route more times than she could count, and William followed beside her, not too close, not too far, adjusting his stride to match hers without thinking about it. The city at night was different at this hour, less crowded, more honest, the noise reduced to distant engines and the occasional hum of a passing bus. And for the first time in years, William noticed the spaces between things, the quiet corners that did not appear on maps or investment plans. "It is this way," Amara said softly, turning down a narrower street where the buildings shifted from polished glass to older brick, their windows dim, some dark, some flickering with a tired kind of light, and William nodded, taking in the change without comment, because it did not require explanation, it spoke for itself. They walked in silence for a few steps, and then he noticed the way she glanced back every so often, not at him, but past him, as if checking the distance, measuring time against something unseen, and he realized she was counting, not seconds, but moments until she reached someone waiting. "Does your brother know you are gone?" he asked gently, keeping his voice low so it would not disrupt the rhythm she seemed to rely on, and Amara shook her head once, her eyes forward. "He was sleeping when I left," she said, then added after a breath, "I told him I would be back before he woke up," and the weight of that promise settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. William glanced up at the sky, the clouds hanging low, holding the night in place, and he felt something tighten again. Not pressure this time, but urgency, the kind that did not belong to deadlines or contracts, but to people. They reached a corner where a small convenience store stood closed, its metal gate pulled down, the fluorescent lights inside casting a faint glow through the gaps, and Amara slowed slightly, her steps more careful now, and William followed her lead without asking why. "We are close," she said, almost to herself. And then she turned down an alleyway that opened between two buildings, not dark, but dim, lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered occasionally as if it were deciding whether to stay on or give up, and William hesitated for just a fraction of a second before continuing, not because he was unsure, but because he understood this was where her world existed, beyond the edges of the places he controlled. At the end of the narrow path, A small door came into view, worn, its paint chipped, a faint light visible through the window beside it. And Amara quickened her pace now, no longer measuring, no longer cautious, just moving with purpose, and she reached the door and paused, her hand resting against it for a second, as if steadying herself before opening it. William stopped a few feet behind her, giving her space. But he could feel the shift in the air, the difference between outside and inside, between movement and arrival. And then she pushed the door open gently, stepping inside without hesitation. The room beyond was small, the kind of place that held more than it was built for. A single lamp casting a soft, uneven glow across the space, and in the corner, on a couch that had seen better years, a small figure stirred under a blanket, and Amara's voice changed. Immediately, softer, warmer. "I am back," she whispered, and the child turned slightly, eyes half open, searching, then settling as soon as he recognized her. William remained at the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame, not stepping in yet, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that this moment belonged to them first. And as he watched the little boy reach out, his small hand finding Amara's sleeve, and her sitting beside him, steady and present, he felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Something simple, something clear, the understanding that whatever this night had been when it started, it was no longer something he could walk away from without leaving something important behind. The room carried a quiet that felt different from the street outside, softer, held together by the low hum of the single lamp and the faint sound of rain still tapping against the window. And Amara sat on the edge of the couch with her little brother leaning into her side, his small hand gripping her sleeve as if it were something permanent, something that would not disappear while he held on, and she gently brushed her fingers through his hair, slow, steady, a rhythm that seemed practiced. Something she had done many times before. "You came back," he murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep, and Amara nodded, her chin dipping slightly. "I told you I would," she whispered, and there was no pride in it, no need for acknowledgement, just a simple truth fulfilled. William remained by the doorway, his presence quiet, almost invisible, yet everything about him felt out of place in the small room. The clean lines of his coat, the stillness of someone used to control, now standing in a space that did not follow any of his rules, and he found himself unsure whether to step forward or remain where he was, not because he did not belong, but because he did not want to interrupt something that felt complete without him. The boy shifted slightly, his eyes opening a little more as he noticed the figure near the door, and he blinked, curious but not afraid, his gaze moving from William back to Amara, as if asking a question without words. "This is someone who helped me," Amara said softly, choosing her words carefully. And the boy nodded once, accepting the explanation without hesitation, as children often did when trust had already been established through someone they believed in. William took a slow breath and stepped inside, just a few feet, enough to no longer be separated by the threshold, but still leaving space, his eyes taking in the room more clearly now, the small table with a few items placed neatly, the folded blanket, the careful way everything was arranged as if order had been created not from abundance but from intention. "What is his name?" William asked quietly, his voice low so it would not disrupt the calm that had settled over the space. And Amara glanced down at the boy, her expression softening in a way that had not been visible outside. "His name is Elijah," she said, and the boy gave a small nod as if confirming it himself, his grip on her sleeve loosening slightly now that she was there. William nodded in return, acknowledging him not as a child in need, but as someone present, someone important in the room, and that small shift in recognition seemed to matter more than any gesture he could have made. "Are you warm enough?" William asked after a moment, the question directed at both of them, though his eyes remained gentle, careful not to impose, and Amara glanced at the scarf still wrapped around her neck before answering. "We are okay." And again, it was not a dismissal, it was an honest assessment, one that carried both gratitude and independence at the same time. William stood there for a second longer, feeling the weight of everything he had seen and everything he had not yet understood, and for the first time that night, the question forming in his mind was not about what he could do in that moment, but what had led to this moment existing at all. He looked toward the small lamp, the dim light it cast, and then back at the two of them. And something inside him settled into a quiet certainty, not loud, not dramatic, just clear. "Amara," he said gently, and she looked up at him, her eyes alert again, ready for whatever came next. "No one should have to spend a night like this wondering if the lights will stay on," he continued, his voice steady, and the words were not spoken as judgment, but as a realization. Something he had come to understand only after stepping into their world. Amara did not respond immediately, but she did not look away either, and in that stillness, something passed between them, not trust fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of it, the recognition that this night had already changed something neither of them could take back. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer after his words settled into the quiet room, and something in her expression shifted, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into recognition, as if she understood what he was saying and also understood that words alone did not change nights like this. Elijah had begun to drift again, his small body relaxing against her side, his breathing evening out as the comfort of her presence pulled him back toward sleep, and she adjusted the blanket around him, with careful hands, making sure it covered his shoulders before she looked back at William. "It is not always like this," she said softly, and her voice carried a quiet determination, as if she needed him to know that this moment did not define everything, that there were days, or at least pieces of days, that were different. William nodded slightly, not interrupting, allowing her to continue in her own time, and she added after a pause, "Just some nights," and the way she said some made it feel both smaller and heavier at the same time. William glanced around the room again, noticing details he had missed before, the way the items were arranged with intention, the absence of anything unnecessary, the presence of what mattered most, and he realized that this was not neglect, it was survival shaped into order. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, the question careful, not prying, but necessary in a way he could not ignore. And Amara's eyes lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in thought, as if she was choosing how to answer without saying too much. "My mom works," she said finally, and the sentence stood on its own for a moment before she added, "She tries to make everything work," and there was something in her tone that carried both respect and understanding, the kind that did not come from being told, but from watching closely. William nodded again, absorbing the answer, understanding that there were parts of this story she was not ready to share, and that pushing would only close the space that had begun to open. The lamp flickered once, just briefly, and Amara's eyes moved to it instinctively, a quick glance that revealed more than her words had, and William noticed it immediately, the way her attention sharpened, the way her posture shifted just slightly, as if preparing for something that might or might not happen. The light steadied again, holding its glow, but the moment had already passed. Between them, silent and clear, William took a slow breath and stepped a little closer, still careful, still measured, but no longer standing at a distance, and he lowered his voice even further. "How long have you been taking care of him?" And Amara looked down at Elijah for a second, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, grounding herself before answering. "A while," she said, and then, after a brief pause, "Since he started needing me." And the answer, simple as it was, carried a weight that settled into the room like something permanent. William felt that same shift again, deeper now, not just awareness, but responsibility beginning to take shape, not assigned, not requested, but recognized. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving only the faint sound of water dripping from the edges of the building, and the city beyond continued without noticing the quiet turning point happening inside this small space. William glanced toward the door, then back at Amara, and for a moment he hesitated, not because he was unsure of what needed to be done, but because he understood that whatever came next had to be offered in a way that did not take away her strength. "Amara," he said again, his tone steady, grounded, "you have done more than most people would know how to do." And she looked up at him, surprised, not by the words themselves, but by the way they were spoken, without pity, without exaggeration, just truth. "But you should not have to do it alone," he added, and this time the silence that followed was different, not uncertain, not guarded, but open, as if something had finally been named that both of them already knew. Amara did not respond immediately, but her grip on the edge of the blanket loosened slightly, and her shoulders, which had been held tight in quiet readiness, lowered just a fraction, enough to be noticed, enough to mean something. And in that small shift, William understood that this was the moment where everything could either return to what it had been or begin to change into something neither of them had expected. The silence that followed his words lingered gently in the room, not heavy, not pressing, but present in a way that allowed something new to form between them. And Amara lowered her eyes for a moment, her fingers smoothing the edge of the blanket around Elijah, as if the motion helped her think, helped her stay grounded in something familiar. The lamp flickered again, softer this time, and she glanced up at it instinctively, her attention drawn to that small, uncertain light, and William noticed the way her body responded, not with fear, but with readiness, as if she had learned to prepare before anything actually changed. "It usually stays on," she said quietly, almost as if she was reassuring herself more than him, and William nodded once, his gaze following hers to the lamp, understanding now that the light was not just light, it was stability, something fragile that could not be taken for granted. Elijah shifted in his sleep, murmuring something indistinct, and Amara immediately leaned closer, her hand resting lightly against his back, her presence steady, calming, and the small movement settled him again, his breathing evening out as he drifted deeper into rest. William watched the interaction without speaking, taking in the quiet competence of it, the way she moved with certainty, not because she had been taught, but because she had learned, and something about that realization stayed with him longer than anything else. "Does he sleep through the night?" William asked after a moment, his voice low enough to match the softness of the room, and Amara gave a small nod, her eyes still on her brother. "Most of the time," she said, then added, "if the lights stay on." And the repetition of that detail made it clear that this was not a small concern, it was something that shaped their nights entirely. William exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the lamp, then to the walls, the space itself, and he understood now that what he was seeing was not just a moment of need, it was a pattern, something that repeated itself in ways that should not have to be endured. He took a small step closer, careful not to disrupt the balance that had formed, and lowered himself slightly, so he was not standing over them, his posture adjusting in a way that made him less distant, less separate from the space they occupied. "Amara," he said gently, and she looked up at him again, her expression steady, waiting. "What happens if the lights do go out tonight?" And the question was simple, but it held something deeper beneath it, something that acknowledged the reality she had already hinted at. Amara hesitated for just a second, her eyes moving briefly toward the door, then back to Elijah, and finally returning to William. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet truth in it that did not try to soften anything. "Then I sit with him," she said, "until morning." And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. William felt that same shift again, stronger now. Not just awareness, not just understanding, but something closer to responsibility taking root, something that no longer felt optional. Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the edges of the roof, tapping softly against the ground, and the city moved on, unaware of the quiet decision forming inside this small room. William glanced once more at the lamp, then back at Amara, and something in his expression settled into place, not rushed, not forced, but clear. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "You will not have to do that tonight," he said, and the words did not come with explanation or condition. They simply existed, offered with a certainty that filled the space between them. Amara did not respond immediately, but her eyes held his, searching, measuring, and for the first time since he had met her, there was a flicker of something different there, something fragile but real, something that had not been present before, and in that moment, the quiet beginning of trust took shape, not fully formed, not complete, but enough to change what came next. Amara held his words in the quiet space between them, and for a moment she did not move at all, as if even the smallest reaction might disturb something that had not yet fully settled. And her eyes searched his face again, not quickly, not nervously, but carefully, like someone who had learned that promises needed to be understood before they could be believed. The lamp above them gave a soft hum, steady for now, casting a warm circle of light over the worn couch, and Elijah shifted slightly in. His sleep, his hand still loosely wrapped around the fabric of her sleeve, anchoring himself to her presence without even knowing it. "You do not know that," Amara said quietly after a moment, her voice not challenging, not dismissive, just honest, and William nodded once, accepting the truth in her words without trying to argue against it. "You are right," he said, his tone calm, grounded. "I do not know yet." And the way he said yet changed something, because it did not close the door on uncertainty. It acknowledged it while still leaving room for action. Amara watched him closely, her expression unreadable for a second longer, and then her gaze dropped briefly to the floor before returning to him, as if she was deciding how much of herself to place into this moment. "People say things," she continued softly, "and then the night comes back the same." And the sentence carried no bitterness, only experience, the kind that had repeated often enough to become expected. William felt that again, that quiet shift inside him. But this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt focused, as if everything he had seen, everything he had understood in the last hour had come together into something clear. He took a small breath and glanced toward the corner of the room, noticing a narrow shelf with a few items placed carefully, a folded piece of paper, a small plastic cup, a flashlight with its casing slightly worn, and he stepped closer to it, not intruding, just observing, and he picked up the flashlight gently, turning it in his hand before setting it back exactly where it had been. "You are prepared," he said quietly, more to acknowledge than to comment, and Amara gave a small nod, her shoulders lifting slightly before settling again. "I have to be," she replied, and the simplicity of it made everything else unnecessary. William looked back at her, then at Elijah, and something in his expression steadied further. The hesitation that had been present earlier no longer there, replaced by a quiet kind of resolve that did not need to be announced. "Amara," he said again, and this time his voice carried a different weight, not heavier, but clearer. "What I am saying is not just for tonight." And she looked at him immediately, her attention sharpening, because that was not what she had expected. "Then what are you saying?" she asked, and there was no fear in the question, only precision, as if she needed to understand exactly what he meant before allowing it to matter. William held her gaze, not rushing, not softening what needed to be said. "I am saying that this should not keep happening to you," he answered, and the words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room itself. Amara did not respond right away, but her fingers loosened slightly around the blanket, and her shoulders lowered just a fraction more. The smallest sign that something inside her was shifting, not fully, not completely, but enough to be noticed. Outside, the dripping from the roof slowed, the last traces of rain fading into the quiet of the night, and inside, the lamp continued to glow, steady for now, holding the room together in its small circle of light. William took one more step closer, still careful, still respectful of the space she held, and lowered his voice again. "Let me help you change it," he said. And this time the words did not sound like an offer that could be easily set aside. They sounded like something that had already begun, something that was no longer waiting for permission to exist. Amara looked at him, really looked this time, and for the first time since the night began, the caution in her eyes was joined by something else, something quieter, something fragile, but unmistakable, the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, this night would not return the same way it always had. Amara did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed felt deeper than before, not uncertain, but full, as if something inside her was shifting carefully into place. And she looked down at Elijah for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing, grounding herself in something real before she lifted her eyes back to William. "Change does not usually come this quiet," she said softly, her voice thoughtful rather than doubtful, and William nodded once, understanding what she meant, because in his world, change came with announcements, with numbers, with movement that could be seen and measured. But here, in this small room, it arrived without any of that. Just a conversation, just a choice. "Most of the time it does not," he replied, his tone even. "But that does not mean it cannot start this way." And the words settled between them, not trying to convince, just offering a different possibility. Amara studied him again, longer this time, her gaze steady, searching for something that matched what he was saying. And for the first time, she did not look away quickly. She held the moment, as if she was allowing herself to consider something she had not allowed before. Elijah shifted slightly, his small hand loosening from her sleeve, and she adjusted the blanket again with gentle care, her movements slower now, less guarded, and William noticed the difference. The way her shoulders no longer held the same tight readiness they had earlier, as if a small part of her had decided it was safe to rest, even if only for a moment. The lamp gave another soft flicker, and both of them glanced at it. But this time, Amara did not tense the same way. She simply watched it steady again, and that small change did not go unnoticed. "If the lights stay on," she said quietly, almost as if she was thinking out loud, "he sleeps through the night." And William nodded, following her thought, understanding now that the solution she needed was not complicated. It was consistent, something reliable, something that would not disappear when the night got longer. He looked around the room once more, taking in the details with new clarity, and then his gaze returned to her, steady, certain. "Then we make sure they stay on," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that did not require explanation. Amara's eyes widened just slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of what those words implied, and she sat a little straighter, her attention fully on him now. "That is not something you can promise," she said carefully. And again, there was no resistance in her voice, only truth, and William accepted it without hesitation. "You are right," he said. "It is not something I should promise without action." And for the first time since he had entered the room, he reached into his coat pocket again, not for distraction, not for distance, but for purpose. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up softly in the dim room, and he paused for just a second, looking at it as if it represented something different now, something that could finally be used for more than numbers and deals. Then he tapped the screen, dialing a number he did not usually call for something like this, and as the line rang, he stepped slightly to the side, still within view, still present, not turning away from her, but not pulling the moment entirely into himself either. When the call connected, his voice remained low, calm, but carried a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And though Amara could not hear the other side, she watched him carefully, noticing the way his tone did not change, did not soften into negotiation, did not harden into command. It stayed steady, purposeful, a few short sentences, nothing more, and then he ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket as if it had done exactly what it was meant to do. He looked back at her, his expression unchanged but more certain now, and the room felt different again, not because anything visible had shifted, but because something invisible had already begun to move. "It will not be tonight," he said quietly, "and it will not be the next night either." And the way he said it was not loud, not dramatic, but grounded in something that did not need to prove itself. Amara held his gaze, and for the first time since she had spoken those words in the rain, there was no hesitation in her eyes, only a quiet, careful acceptance that something had already started to change, and this time, it did not feel like something that would disappear. When the night returned, the room remained still after his words, but it was no longer the same stillness as before. It carried a quiet sense of direction now, something that had begun to move even if nothing visible had changed yet. And Amara sat there with her hands resting lightly on the blanket, her fingers no longer gripping it as tightly, her posture softer in a way that had not been possible earlier. Elijah shifted again, letting out a small breath as he settled deeper into sleep, his face relaxed in the steady glow of the lamp, and Amara watched him for a moment longer, as if confirming that he was truly resting before she looked back at William. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice calm, not demanding, not suspicious, just needing to understand the shape of what had been set in motion. And William did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that the explanation mattered as much as the action itself. He took a slow breath, glancing briefly at the lamp again, then back at her. "I made sure someone is coming to take care of the power," he said, keeping his words simple, grounded in something she could see, not just for tonight, but moving forward. And the way he said moving forward carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room. Amara listened carefully, her eyes steady, and for a second she said nothing, as if testing the idea against everything she had known before. And then she asked quietly, "Why?" And the question was not about doubt. It was about meaning, about understanding why someone would step into a night like this and decide to change it. William met her gaze without hesitation, and for the first time, there was no distance in his answer, no barrier shaped by habit or position. "Because you should not have to carry this by yourself," he said, his voice even. "And because I can help make it different." And there was no performance in his tone, no need to prove anything, just a statement that felt complete. On its own, Amara lowered her eyes for a moment, her fingers tracing a small line along the edge of the blanket as if grounding herself again. And then she looked back up, her expression quieter now, less guarded. "People say they can help," she said softly, "but they do not stay." And William nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that without trying to dismiss it. "Then I will stay," he replied, not raising his voice, not adding anything more to it. And the simplicity of the statement made it heavier than anything else he could have said. The lamp flickered once again, briefly, and Amara's eyes moved to it out of instinct. But this time, she did not tense. She simply watched it steady, and when she looked back at him, something had changed, not completely, not all at once, but enough to be seen. "You do not even know us," she said, and there was no resistance in the words, only a quiet observation, and William gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I know enough," he answered, his gaze shifting briefly to Elijah, then back to her. "I know that you kept your promise tonight," and the words landed softly, but they carried recognition, something deeper than help, something closer to respect. Amara held his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the room filled with the quiet hum of the lamp and the soft rhythm of Elijah's breathing. And in that stillness, something settled between them, not a decision spoken out loud, but one that had already been made. Outside, the last of the rain had stopped completely, leaving the night clear and still, and inside, the small circle of light held steady, no longer flickering, no longer uncertain. William shifted slightly, his posture easing in a way that matched the room now, and he looked at Amara again, his voice quieter than before, but more certain. "This is where it changes," he said, and for the first time since the night began, Amara did not question it. She did not pull back. She simply nodded, just once, a small movement, but enough to mean that she had heard him, enough to mean that she was allowing the possibility to exist. And in that moment, the night that had started with nowhere to go had begun to become something neither of them had expected. The quiet in the room no longer felt fragile, it felt held, as if something invisible had settled into place and decided to stay. And Amara remained seated beside Elijah, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder, but her posture was different now, not as tightly wound, not as ready to brace against the next moment. And William stood a few steps away, no longer at the edge of the space, but not fully within it either, respecting the balance that had formed between them. The lamp above them gave a steady glow, no flicker this time, its light soft but constant, and Amara glanced at it again, almost out of habit, and then back at William, her eyes quieter, less guarded, as if she was beginning to believe that this steadiness might last longer than a single moment. "When will they come?" she asked gently, her voice carrying both curiosity and caution, and William checked his watch briefly before answering. "Soon," he said. "They are already on their way." And the certainty in his tone did not waver, it remained grounded, measured, the same way it had been since he made the call. Amara nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, and for a moment she looked down at her brother again, watching him sleep with a softness that had not been visible earlier, as if a part of her had finally allowed itself to rest alongside him. The sound of a car passing outside reached them faintly, followed by the distant closing of a door somewhere down the street, small reminders that the world beyond this room was still moving, still turning, even as everything inside felt suspended in something calmer. William took a slow breath and looked around once more, noticing how carefully everything had been arranged, how every item seemed to have a purpose, and he realized that this space, small as it was, had been built not from comfort, but from care, and that understanding stayed with him as something he would not forget. "Amara," he said after a moment, his voice steady but softer than before, and she looked up at him immediately, her attention fully present. When the power is stable, when everything is working the way it should, there are other things we can take care of too. And he did not rush the words, he let them exist one at a time, giving them room to be understood. Amara listened, her expression thoughtful, and she did not interrupt. She did not ask for details. She simply allowed the idea to sit with her, as if she was learning how to receive something she had never expected. Like what? She asked quietly after a second, and William met her gaze, his answer clear. Things that make it easier for you to be a child again. And the words were simple, but they carried something deeper than anything he had said before, something that reached beyond the immediate problem and into something larger. Amara's eyes shifted slightly at that, not pulling away, but adjusting, as if the idea itself was unfamiliar, and she looked down at her hands for a moment. Before looking back at him, I do not know how to do that, she admitted softly, and there was no shame in the admission, only honesty. William nodded once, understanding more than she might have expected. That is okay, he said, his voice calm. You will not have to figure it out alone. And the reassurance did not come as a promise made lightly. It came as something already in motion, something that had already begun. Elijah stirred again, letting out a small breath before settling back into stillness, and Amara adjusted the blanket once more, her movements gentle, automatic, and William watched the way she did it. The way care came naturally to her, and he understood that whatever came next would not take that away. It would simply give her the space to carry it differently. Outside, a pair of headlights passed slowly across the window, then stopped, and the faint sound of a car engine idling reached them through the quiet. And William glanced toward the door before looking back at Amara, his expression steady, unchanged. They are here, he said softly, and Amara followed his gaze, her eyes moving toward the door, and for a moment she did not stand, she did not rush. She simply sat there, holding the moment just a little longer, as if recognizing that everything that came next would begin from this exact point. And then, slowly, she nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement that she was ready to step into whatever change had already begun to unfold. Amara stood slowly, careful not to wake Elijah as she gently eased his hand from her sleeve and adjusted the blanket one more time, her movements steady, practiced, and for a moment she looked down at him longer than before, as if memorizing the calm on his face under the steady light, and then she turned toward the door. Her steps quiet but certain. William moved aside slightly, giving her space as she reached for the handle, and when she opened it, the cool night air slipped in softly, carrying with it the faint hum of the car waiting outside, its headlights casting a soft glow across the narrow space just beyond the doorway. A man stepped out of the vehicle, dressed simply, carrying a small toolkit in one hand and a folder in the other, his presence calm, unhurried, and he gave a brief nod as his eyes adjusted to the interior light, taking in the scene without question. Good evening, he said quietly, respectful of the hour and the stillness of the room, and William returned the nod, stepping forward just enough to meet him without disrupting the balance inside. Everything is set? William asked, his voice low but clear, and the man nodded once. Yes, sir, we will take care of it tonight and make sure it stays consistent. And the simplicity of the answer matched the tone that had carried through the entire night, direct, without excess. Amara stood just inside the doorway, watching the exchange, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and she did not speak. She simply observed, as if confirming that what had been said earlier was now becoming something real, something that existed beyond words. The man stepped inside briefly, moving with quiet efficiency, checking the small panel near the wall, adjusting something with careful hands, and within moments, the faint hum of the electricity in the room shifted, subtle but noticeable, the light growing just a touch steadier, more certain, and Amara's eyes moved to the lamp immediately, not out of fear this time, but out of recognition, and when it held without flicker, something in her shoulders relaxed fully for the first time that night. It will not cut out anymore, the man said gently, finishing his work and stepping back, and William gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Thank you, he replied, and the man offered a brief, respectful glance toward Amara before making his way back outside, the door closing softly behind him. The room returned to quiet, But it was a different quiet now, one that did not carry uncertainty, one that felt complete, and Amara remained standing for a moment, her eyes still on the lamp, watching it as if expecting it to change. And when it did not, she turned slowly back toward William. "It stayed on," she said softly, and the words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something that had not been present before, and William met her gaze, his expression calm, steady. "It will," he answered, not as a reassurance, but as a fact already in place. Amara looked at him for a moment longer, and then she gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement she had given earlier, but this time it held something more, something certain, and she stepped back toward the couch, sitting beside Elijah once again, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder, but now there was no tension in it, no readiness to brace against what might come next. William remained where he was, watching the small scene settle into something new, something steady, and for the first time since he had stepped into that rainy night, he felt the absence of urgency, replaced by something quieter, something lasting. The lamp continued to glow, unwavering, casting its soft light across the room, and Amara leaned slightly closer to her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are okay," she said, and though Elijah did not wake, the words seemed to settle into the space around them. William took a slow breath, his gaze lingering on the two of them, and then he spoke one last time, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of everything that had changed. "You are safe now." And this time, the words did not feel like a promise waiting to be tested. They felt like something that had already been proven true.